In 1936, when America unveiled its new semi-automatic rifle, the military brass laughed. Too complicated, too heavy, too unreliable, they said. But just a few years later, on the blood-soaked fields of Europe and the Pacific, those same soldiers would owe their lives to it. This was the rifle Adolf Hitler reportedly called the greatest battle implement ever devised. The M1 Garand, a weapon so far ahead of its time, it changed how wars were fought. But its story isn't just about steel and gunpowder. It's about one man's obsession, a nation's doubt, and the moment the world realized the joke had become America's deadliest advantage. Picture a dimly lit testing range in Springfield, Massachusetts. The year is 1936. A handful of military officers stand with arms crossed, skepticism carved into their faces. Before them sits a strange-looking rifle, longer than the standard issue, heavier, with an unusual gas-operated mechanism visible along its barrel. "It'll jam in the mud," one officer mutters. "Too many moving parts," another adds, shaking his head. "Our boys need reliability, not some machinist's fantasy." The rifle cracks once, twice, 8 times without reloading. The officers remain unimpressed. They've seen prototypes before. They've seen promises. What they haven't seen is proof that could survive the chaos of war. They had no idea this weapon would change everything. To understand why the M1 Garand mattered, we must first understand what came before it. We must return to the trenches of World War I, where American soldiers fought with weapons designed in the previous century. The Springfield 1903, a bolt-action rifle. Beautiful in its simplicity, deadly in the right hands, but painfully, fatally slow. Imagine yourself in those trenches. The whistle blows. You rise from the mud, rifle in hand. You aim, you fire. Now comes the critical moment. You must pull back the bolt, eject the spent cartridge, push the bolt forward, chamber a new round, and only then can you fire again. In that span of seconds, the enemy has already fired twice, maybe 3 times. The mathematics of survival were brutal. A trained rifleman could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute with a bolt-action rifle. But in the chaos of combat, with hands shaking and adrenaline flooding the bloodstream, that number dropped dramatically. And while you were cycling that bolt, men were dying. The Great War had proven something terrifying. Modern warfare moved faster than the weapons designed to fight it. Machine guns could unleash hundreds of rounds per minute, but they were heavy, required crews to operate, and couldn't be carried by individual soldiers advancing across no man's land. What the infantry needed was impossible: the firepower of an automatic weapon in a package light enough for one man to carry. The ability to fire repeatedly without the vulnerable pause of manual reloading. Speed, reliability, power. But in the years following World War I, the American military establishment wasn't looking for revolutionary change. They were looking backward, not forward. The generals and procurement officers who controlled weapon development had come of age in an earlier era. They trusted what they knew: bolt-action rifles that had served since the Spanish-American War. They believed in marksmanship, in careful aim, in the romance of the single perfect shot. Semi-automatic rifles had been attempted before. The French had tried. The Germans had experimented. Various prototypes had crossed desks at the War Department, each promising to revolutionize infantry combat, and each had failed. They were too heavy. They jammed constantly. They required perfect conditions and meticulous maintenance. In the rain, the mud, the dust of actual combat, they broke down. Soldiers couldn't trust them. And in war, trust in your weapon means everything. So by the 1920s, the attitude at Springfield Armory and in Washington was clear. Semi-automatic rifles were a fantasy, impractical, a waste of resources. The bolt-action rifle had won wars before. It would win them again. This was the wall of skepticism that would greet one quiet machinist with an impossible dream. John Cantius Garand was not a soldier. He was not an officer or a weapons theorist or a graduate of any military academy. He was a machinist, precise, methodical, and utterly obsessed with solving problems that others had abandoned. Born in Quebec in 1888, Garand emigrated to the United States as a young man, drawn by opportunity and the promise of work. He found employment in textile mills, then in machine shops, places where metal was shaped into purpose, where tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. His was a world of lathes and drill presses, of caliper measurements and blueprint revisions. While other men dreamed of wealth or fame, Garand dreamed in mechanisms. The perfect angle of a gas port, the ideal spring tension, the geometry of parts moving in precise harmony. Those who knew him described a man of few words. He didn't boast about his ideas. He didn't seek attention. He simply worked, sometimes 16 hours a day, consumed by the challenge before him. His workshop at Springfield Armory became a sanctuary. Here, surrounded by metal shavings and half-assembled prototypes, Garand attacked the problem that had defeated so many others: how to make a rifle fire itself. The concept was elegant. When a rifle fires, it produces enormous energy, the explosion of gunpowder that propels the bullet forward. Most of that energy is wasted, vented into the air. But what if you could capture some of it? What if you could redirect that explosive force to automatically eject the spent cartridge and chamber a new round? Other designers had attempted this through various mechanisms. Recoil-operated systems used the backward kick of firing to cycle the action. Blowback systems used the pressure of spent gases. Each had advantages. Each had fatal flaws. Garand chose a gas-operated system, tapping off a small amount of propellant gas through a port in the barrel. This gas would drive a piston, which would drive a operating rod, which would unlock the bolt, extract the empty casing, cock the hammer, and chamber a fresh round, all in a fraction of a second. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a nightmare. The first prototypes rattled themselves apart. Gas ports eroded under extreme pressure. Springs broke. The timing was wrong. Parts moving too fast or too slow, jamming the mechanism. Heat warped components. Dirt infiltrated the action. Garand would rebuild. Test. Fail. Rebuild again. He filled notebooks with calculations, sketches, revisions. He tested different steels, different coatings, different geometries. Each failure taught him something. Each breakdown revealed a weakness to be overcome. His colleagues at Springfield Armory watched with a mixture of admiration and pity. They saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the obsessive focus. Some thought he was chasing an impossible dream. Others quietly hoped he might succeed. But year after year, the prototypes failed. And year after year, the military's interest waned. By the early 1930s, John Garand had spent over a decade on his semi-automatic rifle. He had sacrificed normal working hours, normal social life, everything that wasn't the problem before him. His entire existence had narrowed to a single question: could he build a rifle that worked? The path from concept to reality was paved with failure, frustration, and a bureaucracy that seemed designed to crush innovation. In 1929, the U.S. Army held formal trials for a new semi-automatic rifle. Multiple designs competed, including Garand's prototype. The tests were exhaustive: accuracy trials, endurance tests, exposure to extreme temperatures, mud, dust, and water. Garand's rifle showed promise. It fired faster than any bolt action. When it worked beautifully. But reliability remained elusive. In one memorable test, the rifle jammed after fewer than 100 rounds, the bolt frozen in place by accumulated carbon fouling. The Army rejected it. Garand returned to his workshop, the weight of failure heavy on his shoulders. But he didn't quit. He couldn't. The problem consumed him. Somewhere in the precise interaction of metal and gas and spring tension, there was an answer. He just had to find it. He redesigned the gas system, altering the size and position of the port. He experimented with different operating rod designs, seeking the perfect balance between power and control. He tested new metallurgy, working with Springfield's engineers to develop steel alloys that could withstand the heat and pressure. Each modification required new parts to be machined, new prototypes to be assembled, new tests to be conducted. The work was painstaking, measured in millimeters and minutes, in incremental improvements that might or might not solve the underlying problems. And always, there was the bureaucracy. Military procurement moved at a glacial pace. Each decision filtered through committees and review boards. Every request for funding had to be justified. Every design change had to be documented and approved. Officers who controlled the budget weren't engineers. They were administrators, risk-averse men who had seen countless revolutionary designs fail. To them, Garand's rifle was just another expensive experiment. "Why do we need this?" they asked. "The 1903 Springfield has served us well, but this can fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier can pull the trigger," Garand would explain, his voice quiet but insistent. "And how often does a soldier need to fire 8 rounds quickly?" It was a question that revealed a fundamental disconnect. The officers making decisions about weapons had fought the last war, not the next one. They couldn't envision how increased firepower might change tactics, strategy, the very nature of infantry combat. Garand pressed on. Through the early 1930s, he continued refining his design. He solved the gas port erosion problem with a redesigned gas cylinder. He improved the bolt-locking mechanism, making it more reliable under stress. He simplified the trigger assembly, reducing potential points of failure. By 1934, he had a rifle that consistently fired without jamming. It was accurate. It was relatively lightweight. It was, by any objective measure, a remarkable achievement. The Army scheduled new trials. This time, Garand's rifle performed better. It fired thousands of rounds with minimal malfunctions. It operated in rain, in dust, in temperatures from below freezing to over 100 degrees. Observers noted its remarkable accuracy and the speed with which a skilled shooter could engage multiple targets. But skepticism remained. The rifle was complex, more complex than anything the Army had fielded before. It required more training. It cost more to manufacture. And there was no combat data, no proof that this mechanical sophistication would survive the ultimate test of war. "It's impressive," one senior officer admitted, "but is it necessary?" Other designs were still in the running. John Peterson, a respected firearms designer, had submitted his own semi-automatic rifle, a delayed blowback design that was lighter than Garand's and used a different operating principle. To many, it seemed the safer choice. The competition intensified. Behind closed doors, advocates for each design argued their case. Politics entered the equation. Who had connections? Whose design threatened whose department? What the budget could support? For Garand, it was agonizing. His rifle worked. He had proven it. But proof wasn't enough. He needed belief. He needed someone in authority to look at his invention and say, "This is the future." In 1936, that moment finally arrived. Secretary of War Harry Woodring and Army Chief of Staff Malin Craig reviewed the test results. They considered the international situation, Japan's aggression in Asia, Germany's rearmament, the possibility that America might one day need to fight a modern war with modern weapons. They made a decision that would echo through history. The M1 Garand was officially adopted as the standard service rifle of the United States Army. John Garand had won, but the real test was still to come. Official adoption didn't silence the doubters. If anything, it amplified them. Military traditionalists were horrified. A semi-automatic rifle as a standard issue? For every soldier? The complaints flooded in from officers across the Army. "It's too heavy," they protested. The M1 weighed 9.5 pounds empty, compared to 8.7 pounds for the Springfield 1903. That difference might seem trivial, but soldiers who had to carry rifles for miles through difficult terrain noticed every ounce. "It's too complicated." The M1 had far more parts than a bolt-action rifle. Springs, gas cylinders, operating rods, triggers mechanisms that required precise timing. What happened when those parts broke in the field? Could an average soldier perform repairs? It wastes ammunition. This was perhaps the most persistent criticism. The M1's 8-round en-bloc clip allowed rapid fire, but critics argued that soldiers would simply spray bullets wildly, exhausting their ammunition supply. Marksmanship would suffer. Discipline would erode. And then there was the infamous ping. When the M1's last round was fired, the empty clip ejected automatically with a distinctive metallic ping. Critics seized on this as a fatal flaw. The enemy will hear it and know the soldier is empty, they warned. They'll rush forward in that vulnerable moment. It seemed like every aspect of Garand's design attracted criticism. Even officers who acknowledged the rifle's firepower worried about logistics. Semi-automatic rifles consume more ammunition than bolt actions. That meant more production, more shipping, more supply lines to maintain. In a major war, could American industry support it? Springfield Armory began production in 1937, but the initial pace was slow. Manufacturing the M1 required new machinery, new quality control procedures, new training for the workers who would build it. The tight tolerances that made the rifle function reliably also made it challenging to mass produce. Early production models had issues. Some rifles experienced problems with the gas cylinder. Others had extractor failures. There were reports of stocks cracking under sustained fire. Each problem required investigation, solution, and modification of the production process. Meanwhile, soldiers began receiving the new rifle. Their reactions were mixed. Some immediately appreciated the firepower advantage. The ability to fire 8 rounds quickly, to engage multiple targets without cycling a bolt, felt revolutionary. These soldiers became evangelists for the M1, praising its performance at every opportunity. Others struggled with the transition. Decades of training with bolt-action rifles had created deeply ingrained habits. The M1 required a different grip, a different shooting stance, a different rhythm of fire. For soldiers trained to carefully aim each shot before cycling the bolt, the rapid-fire capability felt almost wasteful. Training manuals had to be rewritten. Instructors had to develop new drills. The entire institutional knowledge of infantry marksmanship had to evolve to accommodate this new weapon. And through it all, doubt persisted. In officer clubs and military publications, the debate continued. Was the M1 Garand a brilliant innovation or an expensive mistake? Would it prove itself in combat, or would American soldiers end up abandoning it for the reliable simplicity of the bolt action? John Garand, now in his 50s, continued his work at Springfield Armory. He had achieved what he set out to do. His rifle was being manufactured, issued to soldiers, becoming part of America's military arsenal. But he remained perfectionist at heart, constantly seeking improvements, addressing the problems that emerged in testing and early deployment. He was quiet about the criticism. He didn't engage in public debates or write defenses of his design. His answer to the doubters was simple: let the rifle speak for itself. But the rifle's voice would only be heard clearly in one place: the battlefield. September 1st, 1939. German tanks rolled into Poland. World War II had begun. America watched from across the Atlantic, officially neutral, but increasingly aware that isolation might not be possible. In Washington, military planners began preparing for possibilities that had seemed distant just months before. One of those preparations involved the M1 Garand. Production increased dramatically. Springfield Armory expanded its operations, running multiple shifts. Winchester Repeating Arms Company was contracted to build M1s, adding crucial manufacturing capacity. The trickle of rifles became a stream, then a flood. By 1940, as France fell and Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, American factories were producing thousands of M1 Garands per month. Training camps across the United States echoed with their distinctive report as new recruits learned to shoot, maintain, and trust their new weapon. The scale of mobilization was staggering. America's peacetime army of just over 200,000 men would eventually grow to over 8 million. Each would need a rifle, and increasingly, that rifle was the M1 Garand. Manufacturing challenges persisted. The M1 was complex to build, requiring specialized machinery and skilled labor. As production ramped up, quality control became critical. A faulty gas cylinder or improperly heat-treated bolt could cause a malfunction that might cost a soldier his life. Engineers at Springfield and Winchester worked frantically to streamline production without sacrificing reliability. They developed new machining techniques, improved testing procedures, and created detailed technical manuals for the workers building these rifles. The effort was massive. Raw steel arrived at factories by the ton. Giant presses stamped out receiver forgings. Lathes cut barrels with precision measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Workers assembled components, testers fired proof loads, inspectors examined every rifle before it was approved for military use. This was American industrial power awakening, the same energy that would eventually produce ships, planes, tanks, and ammunition in quantities that would overwhelm the Axis powers. But in 1940 and 1941, the outcome was far from certain. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor shattered America's neutrality. The nation was at war. The demand for M1 Garands became urgent. Every training camp, every deployment, every unit heading overseas needed rifles. Production increased again, pushing factories to their limits. By 1942, Springfield and Winchester together were producing over 100,000 M1s per month. Soldiers who had trained with the rifle now prepared to test it in combat. They packed their gear, boarded trains and ships, and headed for distant theaters of war. In their hands, they carried John Garand's invention, 8 pounds of wood and steel that would soon prove its worth. But the rifle was still unproven. All the testing, all the trials, all the manufacturing excellence meant nothing compared to the ultimate question: how would it perform when men's lives depended on it? The first major test came in North Africa. American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch. They were green troops, untested in combat, facing experienced German and Italian forces. The battles that followed would be chaotic, brutal, and revealing. In the rocky hills and desert expanses of North Africa, American soldiers first fired their M1 Garands in anger. The results began filtering back through after-action reports, through letters home, through the first-hand accounts of officers documenting their unit's performance. The rifle worked. In the confusion of combat, when hands shook and hearts pounded, the M1's semi-automatic capability proved decisive. Soldiers could engage enemies quickly, could suppress hostile fire, could advance under fire in ways that would have been impossible with bolt-action rifles. Yes, the rifle still had issues. The N-block clip system could be finicky to load in the dark or under stress. The gas system sometimes failed in extreme dust conditions. Some stock still cracked under sustained use. But these were minor problems compared to the rifle's overwhelming advantage: firepower. American squads could deliver twice the volume of fire as comparable German or Italian units. While enemy soldiers worked their bolt actions, American riflemen were already aiming at their next target. The psychological impact was profound. Facing an American infantry squad felt like facing twice as many men. Word spread through the army. The M1 Garand wasn't just good, it was a game changer. Production increased yet again. By 1943, with American forces preparing for invasions of Sicily and Italy, with plans being drawn for the eventual assault on Fortress Europe, the M1 Garand had become standard issue not just in theory, but in reality. Factories were now producing 150,000 rifles per month. The industrial capacity that doubters had worried about was proving more than adequate. American manufacturing, once it fully mobilized, was a force that the Axis powers simply couldn't match. In training camps, new recruits learned to field strip the M1 blindfolded, to load clips by touch, to clear malfunctions in seconds. The rifle's complexity, once seen as a weakness, became familiar through repetition. Soldiers learned to trust their weapons, and that trust would soon be tested in the most demanding crucible of World War II. The beaches of Normandy awaited. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the coast of France. The largest amphibious invasion in history is underway. Imagine yourself in a Higgins boat, packed shoulder to shoulder with 30 other men. The boat pitches and rolls in heavy seas. Men are seasick, terrified, praying. The distant shore is shrouded in smoke and the flash of explosions. Behind you, the greatest armada ever assembled. Before you, the Atlantic Wall. In your hands, wrapped in protective plastic against the salt spray, is your M1 Garand. The ramp drops. Machine gun fire rakes the boat. Men fall before they reach the water. You plunge into chest-deep surf, holding your rifle high, fighting against the current, against the weight of your equipment, against the terror that threatens to paralyze you. Men are dying all around you. The water turns red. The beach is a killing ground. Mines, obstacles, barbed wire, and above it all, German machine guns firing from concrete bunkers. You reach the shingle, diving behind whatever cover you can find. Your hands are shaking so badly you can barely function. But you have trained for this. Muscle memory takes over. You unwrap your rifle, you chamber a round, and you begin to fire. This moment, replicated thousands of times across Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, the British and Canadian sectors, would validate everything John Garand had created. The M1's semi-automatic capability allowed American soldiers to return fire quickly, to suppress enemy positions, to advance under fire in a way that would have been impossible with bolt-action rifles. While German soldiers worked their Mauser bolts, American riflemen were already firing again. Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. York, who landed at Omaha Beach, later wrote, "The M1 saved lives that day. When you're pinned down on a beach with machine guns firing over your head, the ability to return rapid fire is everything. Men who might have died with bolt actions survived because they could shoot back faster. But the rifle's real test came in the days and weeks that followed. The hedgerow country of Normandy was a nightmare. Narrow lanes bordered by thick earthen walls topped with dense vegetation. Visibility was measured in yards. Every field was a potential ambush site. Combat was sudden, brutal, and at close range. Here, the M1 Garand proved its superiority again and again. When German soldiers appeared suddenly at close range, American GIs could engage instantly, firing multiple rounds before the enemy could react. The rifle's accuracy allowed precise shooting even in the confusion of hedgerow combat. Sergeant Bill Hancock, 29th Infantry Division, described a typical firefight. "We were moving up a lane when Germans opened up from a hedgerow maybe 40 yards away. Before the war, I'd trained on the 03 Springfield. With that, I'd have gotten maybe 2 shots off before diving for cover. With the Garand, I emptied a full clip at their position, saw 2 men fall, and had reloaded before I hit the ground. The Germans pulled back. We advanced. That's how it went, field after field, day after day." The rifle's reliability also proved crucial. Normandy in June was wet. Soldiers lived in mud, rain soaked their equipment, and rifles were constantly exposed to dirt and moisture. The M1, despite earlier worries about its complexity, continued to function. Soldiers learned that with basic maintenance, a quick wipe down, a few drops of oil, the rifle would keep shooting. Stories spread through the army. A rifleman whose M1 had been submerged in a stream, dried it out, and fired it successfully an hour later. A squad that held off a German counterattack, 8 M1s delivering such rapid fire that the Germans thought they were facing a machine gun position. A sniper who used his Garand to pick off targets at 500 yards, then switched to rapid fire when enemies closed in. The famous ping of the ejecting clip, once criticized as a fatal flaw, turned out to be a non-issue. In the chaos of combat, with explosions, shouting, and constant gunfire, no enemy soldier could hear or react to one tiny metallic sound. And the speed with which a trained soldier could reload, 2 seconds, maybe 3, meant any theoretical vulnerability was negligible. As American forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France in August 1944, the M1 Garand's performance continued to impress. Tank crews fighting as infantry, artillerymen pressed into defensive roles, support troops forced into combat, all found the rifle easy to use and devastatingly effective. The Pacific Theater told a similar story. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines, American Marines and soldiers faced a different kind of war. Combat ranges were often closer than in Europe. Ambushes were sudden and vicious. The environment was brutal. Heat, humidity, rust-inducing salt air. German soldiers called it that damned American rifle. On both the eastern and western fronts, German troops had grown accustomed to the rhythm of bolt-action combat. The Soviet Mosin Nagant, the British Lee Enfield, their own carabiner 98K, all required manual operation between shots. Experienced soldiers knew the timing, knew the vulnerabilities, knew when an enemy was reloading. The M1 Garand destroyed that calculus. German after-action reports from France, Italy, and later Germany itself repeatedly mentioned the Americans' superior rate of fire. Wehrmacht officers, analyzing why their troops were taking heavier casualties in engagements with American forces, identified the M1 as a significant factor. One captured German document, a tactical analysis from 1944, warned, American infantry can maintain continuous fire without the pause for manual reloading. This allows them to suppress defensive positions and advance under fire more effectively than other Allied forces. Recommended countermeasure: increase automatic weapons allocation to frontline units. But Germany, by 1944, lacked the industrial capacity to re-equip its entire army. They were losing the production war, unable to manufacture sufficient weapons, ammunition, and equipment to match Allied output. While every American infantryman carried a semi-automatic rifle, German soldiers made do with what they had, mostly bolt actions supplemented by a smaller number of automatic weapons. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. German soldiers who survived combat against American forces told interrogators that the intensity of American small arms fire was shocking. Some mistakenly believed that American squads were equipped with far more machine guns than intelligence reports indicated. They couldn't accept that individual riflemen were producing such volume of fire. In the Pacific, Japanese reactions were even more dramatic. Japanese military doctrine emphasized marksmanship and disciplined fire. Their Arisaka Type 38 and Type 99 rifles were well-made bolt actions, accurate and reliable. But against the M1 Garand, they were outmatched. Japanese tactical manuals captured late in the war showed attempts to adapt to American firepower. One document advised, American soldiers can fire many shots quickly. Do not expose yourself for long. Use rapid movement and concealment. But tactical adjustments couldn't overcome the fundamental disadvantage. In the brutal close-quarters fighting of Pacific Island campaigns, Japanese soldiers found themselves unable to match American rates of fire. Banzai charges, which had sometimes succeeded against other Allied forces, were devastated by American defenders armed with M1 Garands. The most famous quote about the M1 Garand, that Hitler called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, has been debated by historians. There's no definitive source for this statement, and it may be apocryphal or a misattribution. However, German military leaders certainly recognized the rifle's superiority. General George S. Patton, not known for understatement, called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and this quote may have been later attributed to Hitler to emphasize the point. Regardless of the quote's origin, the sentiment was accurate. The M1 Garand was the finest standard infantry rifle of World War II. What's indisputable is that both German and Japanese military establishments attempted to develop their own semi-automatic rifles during the war. Germany produced the Gewehr 43, a semi-automatic rifle introduced in 1943, but only manufactured about 400,000, a tiny fraction of the millions of Kar 98K bolt actions they continued to produce. It was too little, too late. Japan experimented with semi-automatic designs but never fielded them in significant numbers. Their industrial capacity, strained by the demands of naval and air warfare, couldn't support mass production of complex infantry weapons. The Soviet Union, America's ally, also took notice. Soviet forces used mostly bolt-action motion nagant rifles throughout the war, supplemented by submachine guns. But Soviet military observers who witnessed American forces in action were impressed by the M1's performance. This observation would influence post-war Soviet small arms development. Perhaps the most telling enemy reaction was the simplest: survival rates. Statistical analysis of World War II combat showed that American infantry units, when equipped with M1 Garands, suffered fewer casualties in comparable engagements than Allied units armed with bolt-action rifles. The rifle's combination of firepower, accuracy, and reliability translated directly into tactical advantage and saved lives. German prisoners, when interviewed, often expressed respect for American equipment. One Wehrmacht veteran captured in France told his interrogators, "We knew when we were facing Americans because of the sound of their rifles. That rapid fire, that constant shooting, it meant you had to keep your head down." With British or French forces, we could sometimes exploit the gaps when they reloaded. With Americans, there were no gaps. This was the ultimate validation of John Garand's work. His rifle hadn't just met the requirements for a modern infantry weapon, it had exceeded them so dramatically that it changed how wars were fought. The advantage it provided wasn't subtle or theoretical. It was concrete, measurable, and recognized even by those on the receiving end. The M1 Garand had become not just a weapon, but a force multiplier that enhanced the effectiveness of every soldier who carried it. When World War II ended in 1945, over 4 million M1 Garands had been produced. They had armed the soldiers who liberated Europe, who island-hopped across the Pacific, who fought in some of history's most brutal battles. But the rifle story didn't end with victory. The M1 Garand continued as the U.S. military's standard infantry rifle through the Korean War. On the frozen hills and in the brutal fighting of that conflict, the rifle proved itself again. American soldiers faced Chinese and North Korean forces armed primarily with bolt-action rifles and submachine guns. The M1's combination of range, accuracy, and firepower remained dominant. One of the war's iconic photographs shows a Marine on a Korean hillside, M1 Garand in hand, the weapon looking as ready for combat as it had on Normandy's beaches 7 years earlier. The rifle had become timeless, a proven design that continued to serve effectively even as military technology rapidly advanced. But evolution was inevitable. The lessons learned from the M1 Garand influenced firearms design worldwide. The concept of a standard semi-automatic infantry rifle, once considered radical, became the new baseline. Every nation's military began developing or adopting similar weapons. In America, the M14 rifle emerged in 1957 as the M1 successor. It retained Garand's basic operating system, the gas-operated rotating bolt design, but adapted it for a smaller cartridge and added selective fire capability. The M14 could fire semi-automatically like the M1, or switch to full automatic. It used a detachable box magazine instead of the en-bloc clip. The M14's service life as the standard U.S. rifle was brief, just 7 years before being replaced by the M16 in Vietnam. But its existence proved that Garand's fundamental design principles were sound enough to evolve and adapt to new requirements. Around the world, other nations followed similar paths. The Soviet Union, which had observed American M1 performance during the war, developed the SKS semi-automatic carbine in 1945. It used a gas-operated system similar in concept to the M1, though adapted to the smaller 7.62 by 39 mm intermediate cartridge. The SKS itself was quickly superseded by the AK-47, the iconic assault rifle designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov. The AK-47 was selective fire rather than semi-automatic only, but it too used a gas-operated system with a rotating bolt, principles that John Garand had refined and proven in combat. The lineage is clear. The M1 Garand demonstrated that semi-automatic rifles could be reliable, accurate, and effective as standard infantry weapons. Once that barrier was broken, once the skepticism was overcome by battlefield performance, the entire world's military forces moved in the same direction. By the 1960s, the bolt-action rifle as a primary infantry weapon was obsolete. Every modern military force fielded semi-automatic or selective fire rifles. The change in warfare that the M1 Garand pioneered had become universal. The rifle itself remained in service remarkably long. Even after the M14's adoption, M1 Garands continued to arm reserve and National Guard units through the 1960s. They were used for ceremonial purposes, for training, and as backup weapons. Some remained in military inventory into the 1970s. Surplus M1 Garands were also distributed to allied nations. Through various military assistance programs, the rifles equipped forces in South Korea, Italy, Greece, and dozens of other countries. In some cases, these Garands remained in active service into the 1990s, more than 50 years after their design. The civilian market embraced the M1 as well. Through the Civilian Marksmanship Program, surplus rifles were sold to American citizens for sport shooting and collecting. The program continues today, and M1 Garands remain prized possessions for collectors and competitive shooters. The rifle's accuracy and reliability made it a favorite for high-power rifle competitions. Skilled shooters could achieve remarkable precision with the M1, regularly hitting targets at ranges beyond 600 yards. The national matches at Camp Perry, America's premier shooting competition, featured M1 Garands prominently for decades. But beyond the technical specifications and the service records, the M1 Garand's true legacy is more profound. It changed how military planners thought about infantry weapons. It proved that soldiers could be trusted with rapid-fire weapons, that increased firepower enhanced rather than diminished combat effectiveness, that innovation could overcome institutional resistance. John Garand himself remained at Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953. He continued working on firearm designs, holding dozens of patents for various improvements and innovations. But the M1 rifle remained his masterpiece, the achievement that defined his career. He was a modest man to the end. When praised for his contribution to the war effort, he would typically deflect, saying he had simply done his job. He never sought fame or fortune from his invention. In fact, he never received any royalties for the M1 Garand. As a government employee, his designs belonged to the United States. There were efforts to compensate him. In 1944, Congress considered a bill to award Garand $100,000 for his contributions. The bill failed. He received a small government pension when he retired, nothing more. He died in 1974 at the age of 86, having lived long enough to see his rifle become a legend. In his final years, veterans would sometimes approach him, wanting to shake the hand of the man who had designed the weapon that kept them alive. These encounters moved him deeply, though he remained characteristically humble about his role. Springfield Armory, where Garand spent his career, closed as an active military facility in 1968. Today it's a National Historic Site, preserving the history of American military firearms manufacturing. Exhibits showcase the M1 Garand prominently, telling the story of its development and impact. The rifle has been called the weapon that won World War II. This is hyperbole. Wars are won by many factors: strategy, logistics, industrial capacity, courage, and sacrifice. But the statement contains a kernel of truth. The M1 Garand gave American soldiers a concrete advantage, a tool that enhanced their effectiveness in combat and saved countless lives. Modern historians and firearms experts consistently rank the M1 Garand among the greatest military rifles ever designed. Its combination of reliability, accuracy, and firepower set a standard that influenced military weapons development for generations. The rifle also became a symbol. For veterans who carried it, the M1 represents their service, their sacrifice, and the weapon they trusted in history's most terrible conflict. The distinctive shape of the Garand, the long barrel, the wooden stock, the operating rod visible along the right side, is instantly recognizable. In museums around the world, M1 Garands are displayed alongside the artifacts of World War II. School children on field trips see them behind glass, these tools of war that help secure the freedom they now enjoy. The rifles are silent now, but they speak volumes about American innovation, determination, and the difference that one brilliant design can make. The M1 Garand proved that a single person, working with dedication and refusing to accept the limitations others imposed, could create something that changed history. John Garand was not a general or a politician. He was a machinist, a technician, an engineer. He worked with his hands and his mind, solving problems that others said couldn't be solved. His reward was not wealth or fame, but the knowledge that his work mattered. Every soldier who came home because the M1's rapid fire suppressed enemy positions, every veteran who lived to old age because they could shoot faster than their enemies, they were John Garand's legacy. Turn with me now to that testing range in Springfield, Massachusetts. The year is in 1936. Military officers stand with crossed arms, skepticism carved into their faces. Before them sits a strange-looking rifle that they don't quite trust. Too complicated, they say. Too heavy. It'll never work in combat. They laugh. Some shake their heads and walk away. They've seen prototypes before. They've heard promises. What they haven't seen is anything that convinces them to abandon the reliable bolt-action rifles they know and trust. The rifle fires 8 times without reloading. The officers remain unimpressed. They had no idea this weapon would change everything. Now move forward through time. Cross the Atlantic. Stand on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. The beach is chaos, smoke, explosions, men running, men falling, men fighting for every yard of sand against a determined enemy entrenched in concrete bunkers. Listen to the sound. Not the single measured shots of bolt-action rifles, but a continuous crackling roar. Thousands of M1 Garands firing, their semi-automatic rhythm creating a wall of sound that speaks of American firepower unleashed. A young soldier, maybe 19 years old, crouches behind a steel obstacle. His hands shake, his heart pounds. He's terrified, but he's trained. He raises his M1, aims at a German position, and fires. Once, twice, 8 times. The clip pings out. He reloads in 3 seconds and fires again. He survives the day. He survives the war. Decades later, he'll tell his grandchildren about the rifle that kept him alive. The weapon he trusted absolutely. The tool that worked when everything else was chaos and terror. That rifle, that trust, that survival, they all trace back to a quiet machinist who refused to quit. John Garand could have stopped after his first failures. He could have accepted the military's rejection and moved on to other projects. He could have decided that the problem was impossible, that the skeptics were right, that semi-automatic rifles were an impractical dream. But he didn't stop. Through a decade of failures and frustrations, through bureaucratic obstacles and technical challenges that would have defeated most men, he persisted. He believed in his vision even when no one else did. This is the deeper story of the M1 Garand. Not just the technical achievement, but the human achievement. One person's refusal to accept limitations. One person's dedication to solving a problem that others had abandoned. One person's work that ultimately saved thousands of lives and changed the course of history. The rifle became iconic, but the lesson is timeless. Innovation requires both brilliance and persistence. It requires the ability to see possibilities that others miss and the determination to pursue those possibilities despite doubt, criticism, and repeated failure. Think about the other inventions that face similar skepticism. The airplane, heavier than air machines cannot fly. The computer, there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. The internet, just a passing fad. Every revolutionary idea encounters resistance. Every innovation that challenges the status quo faces people who say it won't work. It's too complicated. It's unnecessary. The M1 Garand story reminds us that those voices, no matter how authoritative they seem, can be wrong. But the story also reminds us of the cost of innovation. John Garand dedicated his career to one project. He worked 16-hour days. He sacrificed financial gain, receiving no royalties for a design that would be manufactured by the millions. He endured criticism, doubt, and the frustration of seeing his work repeatedly rejected. His reward was not material wealth. It was the quiet satisfaction of seeing his creations succeed, of knowing that his work mattered, of shaking hands with veterans who told him his rifle had saved their lives. In today's world, where we expect instant results and immediate validation, Garand's decade-long struggle offers a different model. Some problems take time. Some achievements require patience, persistence, and the willingness to fail repeatedly before finally succeeding. The M1 Garand also reminds us about the importance of being willing to challenge conventional wisdom. The military establishment of the 1930s knew that semi-automatic rifles were impractical. They had reasons, experience, and expertise to support their skepticism. They weren't foolish or incompetent. They were simply locked into a particular way of thinking. It took an outsider's perspective, a machinist, not a military officer, to see the possibility they missed. Sometimes the breakthrough comes not from the experts in a field, but from someone willing to question the assumptions those experts take for granted. This lesson applies far beyond military history. In every field, in every era, there are accepted truths that may not be true at all. There are impossible problems that are simply waiting for someone persistent enough to solve them. There are opportunities that everyone overlooks because they know something won't work. The M1 Garand's legacy, then, is not just about firepower or military history. It's about human potential, what one dedicated person can achieve, what innovation looks like in practice, and how perseverance can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. When General George S. Patton called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised, he was speaking from experience. He had seen its effect on the battlefield, had commanded soldiers who carried it, had witnessed how it changed the nature of infantry combat. His words carried weight because they were based on results, not theory. But perhaps an even more meaningful tribute came from the soldiers themselves. In letters home, in memoirs written decades later, in quiet conversations among veterans, the same sentiment appears again and again. The M1 was reliable. It worked when we needed it. We trusted it with our lives. That trust was John Garand's greatest achievement, not the patents or the technical specifications or the production numbers, but the knowledge that when young men faced the worst moments of their lives, when everything hung in the balance, the weapon he designed did not fail them. Today, more than 80 years after its adoption, the M1 Garand remains an icon. Collectors seek them. Historians study them. Veterans organizations preserve them as cherished artifacts. The rifle has transcended its original purpose to become a symbol of American innovation and the greatest generation that carried it into battle. But symbols can obscure the human stories behind them. Behind every M1 Garand is John Garand, working late into the night in his Springfield workshop, adjusting a gas port by fractions of an inch, testing another prototype, refusing to quit even when everyone told him his dream was impossible. Behind every symbol is a person. Behind every innovation is struggle. Behind every achievement is doubt overcome. They thought the M1 Garand was a joke. They thought it was too complicated, too heavy, too unreliable. They thought John Garand was wasting his time chasing an impossible dream. But every shot fired from an M1 on Omaha Beach told a different story. Every soldier who came home told a different story. Every veteran who shook John Garand's hand and thanked him told a different story. It was a story of genius and defiance, of one man's vision transforming into millions of rifles, of innovation overcoming skepticism, of a weapon that not only changed how wars were fought, but saved the lives of those who fought them. The M1 Garand changed the course of history because John Garand refused to accept that his vision was impossible. And in that refusal, in that persistence, in that decade-long struggle against doubt and failure and bureaucratic resistance, lies a lesson that transcends any single invention or any single war. The greatest innovations often begin as jokes. The most important breakthroughs often face the fiercest skepticism. And the people who change the world are often those who simply refuse to quit, who continue working when everyone else has walked away, who believe in their vision even when they stand alone. John Garand stood alone for a long time, but ultimately, millions stood with him. Soldiers carrying his rifle, veterans remembering his contribution, historians recognizing his genius. They thought it was a joke, but the M1 Garand had the last word. And that word echoed across the battlefields of World War II in the crack of 8 rounds fired as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger, in the sound of freedom advancing, in the weapon that proved that one dedicated person, working with persistence and skill, can create something that changes everything. The joke became a legend. The skepticism became reverence, and the rifle that shouldn't have worked became the greatest battle implement ever devised. That is the story of the M1 Garand. That is the legacy of John Cantius Garand. And that is why, more than 80 years later, we remember not just the weapon, but the man who refused to quit, the vision that overcame doubt, and the moment when the world realized that what they had dismissed as impossible had become the advantage that helped win the war.